History as it happens, January 18th, 2024. Who are the Houthis?
Today, the UN Security Council demanded that Houthi rebels in Yemen stop attacking international ships in the Red Sea.
If these attacks continue, as they did yesterday, there will be consequences.
The second straight day, U.S. forces carried out strikes against Houthi militia in Yemen.
I can tell the House today that our initial assessment is that all 13 planned targets were destroyed.
We cannot have a situation where a major sea route, a major ability to move goods around the world is being cut off by terrorists and thugs, and we therefore must act.
A rebel movement of Shia Islam that calls itself Defenders of God has been launching missile strikes at commercial ships in the Red Sea. Revenge for what Israel is doing in Gaza. They are the Houthis, backed by Iran, opposed by Saudi Arabia, a militia embroiled in a years-long civil war in Yemen, whose actions represent a dangerous escalation in a region convulsed by violence. So who are these guys? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I am fairly certain that a ceasefire in Gaza would reduce Houthi attacks. I'm less confident that the Houthis would stop attacking altogether, because this has always been about more than just the situation in Gaza. The Houthis are not warriors for the liberation of Palestine. They're a particular group with a particular set of interests, most of which revolve around their own position in Yemen.
I remember watching the Arab Spring unfold on my TV set, 12 years ago already, in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere. Men who had ruled for decades were suddenly ousted from their thrones. I don't know if anyone in the United States saw it coming. I certainly did not. But I did dive into some books about modern Middle Eastern history. I realized I didn't know very much about, say, Ali Abdullah Saleh. He dominated Yemeni political life for 32 years until he was forced from power in early 2012. About 3 years later, a group known as the Houthis seized the capital of Sana'a. That is not a scene from the Arab Spring. It is from a few days ago. Thousands of men, and they were all men, filled the streets of Sana'a in solidarity with Gaza, chanting, "We trust in God. God is great. Death to America. Death to Israel. Curse on Jews. Victory to Islam." They were enraged by U.S. and UK airstrikes on Houthi installations from where the militants have been launching missiles at cargo ships in the Red Sea. This whole situation is of labyrinthine complexity. Yemen's civil war, the role of the Saudis, Iran, the United States. The escalating violence is aggravating concerns of a wider war. I mean, the U.S. just bombed Yemen. President Biden did not bother to consult Congress. So if you ask me, we're now at war with a small militia few Americans know anything about. Gregory Brew is an analyst at Eurasia Group. He is an expert on Iran and the geopolitics of oil and gas, and he is back on the show. Hello, Gregory Brew.
Thanks so much for having me back.
So I've been following your running commentary on X. I was about to call it Twitter. I'm trying to get myself habituated to say X. At GBrew24, and that's BREW. You're running commentary on the Houthis and the crisis, we can call it a crisis, in the Red Sea because global shipping is being affected. We're going to talk about that and the geopolitics of what's happening here and how this all relates to the war in Gaza and U.S. foreign policy, etc. But, why don't we do a brief, maybe encyclopedic type of treatment here? Who are the Houthis?
So the Houthis are rebels. Let's call them what they are. They took power in Yemen in 2014, seized the nation's capital of Sana'a, and currently run about half the country. The other half is run by a separate government and a variety of other groups. But the Houthis are really the ones in charge in most of Yemen. And they are backed by Iran. Iran has been supporting them for really about 10 years. Iran supplies them with weapons, with support, funding, although the Houthis are now capable of supplying their own funding and their own weapons, though they do still need some support from Iran. And the Houthis started targeting passing ships in November, about 6 weeks after the start of the Middle East crisis. They then escalated to the point that they were attacking commercial vessels on a regular basis. And this, of course, has created significant disruptions in commercial traffic through the Red Sea and has increased tensions in the region, culminating in last week's quite dramatic US-UK air and missile strikes on the Houthis.
So the Houthis are a movement, and thank you for correcting my pronunciation, not the Houthis. That's an old rock band, Hootie and the Blowfish. The Houthis, they're a movement, a militant movement, and the name Houthi is from Hussein al-Houthi, a Zaidi sect of Islam, rooted in Zaidi revivalism. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about, who these folks are. They just didn't pop up in 2014. They've been living in the northern part of Yemen for a very, very long time. What are the rebels? Their animating idea. What are they after? Are they trying to effect, say, a religious revolution?
Yeah, so in a sense, yes. The Houthis, or really what they call themselves, Ansar Allah, are Zaidi rebels. They come from the Zaidi sect of Shia Islam. And the Zaidi sect has been a majority in northern Yemen for a very, very long time. So the Houthis have emerged from a local Yemeni context. As far as the Houthis as a geopolitical force, they really come about in the 2010s during a period of instability and significant economic depression in Yemen. They took advantage of a fairly weak Yemeni government and seized control over much of the country. This began a war between the Houthis, the local Yemeni government, which was backed by the Saudi governments of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The Saudis and the UAE were very interested in putting down the Houthi rebellion, both because they were worried about instability in Yemen, but also because they were worried that, the Houthis being sort of a radical Shia sect, given their connections to Iran, given the potential for inspiring increased radicalism or rebelliousness in other Shia minorities in Saudi and elsewhere, created quite a lot of pressure to do something about the Houthi threat in Yemen. And this began a 10-year-long war between the Houthis, supported by Iran on one side, and the local Yemeni government supported by the Saudis and the Emiratis on the other side. That war is really on the verge of coming to an end. The Saudis are in the midst of ceasefire negotiations with the Houthis. And so the Houthis are sort of in a transitional phase, shall we say. They're moving from being underdogs, rebels, sort of fighting for a position, to increasingly looking like a de facto government that rules half of Yemen, that draws its ideology from a particular branch of Shia Islam, but is also starting to do things like levy taxes, organize a bureaucracy, holding parades where they can show off their military prowess. Increasingly, they want to move away from their reputation of being rebels or radicals, and they want to take on more and more of the trappings of a legitimate government. Now, again, this is what the Houthis want the world to see. They want to appear more stable and more legitimate, and they're starting to attack commercial shipping because they feel that may aid in their efforts to be taken more seriously.
And the parts of Yemen they govern in an authoritarian fashion, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, let's cut to the chase here. The Houthis are not nice people. They are authoritarian. They rule through fear, through coercion, through violence. They are certainly not Democrats or believe in representative government by any means. It's really rule by the sword. And they've done a variety of pretty nasty things in Yemen. They have been blamed for the return of slavery to the region. They control their portions of Yemen through brute force and coercion. But they do seem, by all appearances, to be in a fairly secure position. They are well armed, very well organized, and despite these US-UK airstrikes, don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon.
And I want to return to the link to Iran in a little bit. I did mention the charismatic founder of the Houthi movement, Hussein Badr al-Houthi. As you said, their formal name is Ansar Allah, Defenders of God. And thank you, Encyclopedia Britannica, which I have open here. This is how you prepare for a podcast on short order. Following the establishment in Yemen of a Zaidi polity in 893, northern Yemen became the home of a thriving Zaidi community. So they do go back quite a ways. Now, we don't have time to recapitulate the entire history of the Yemen civil war, which, as you said, does seem to be winding down. But a little bit of context here, recent context, more relevant history. In 1990, North and South Yemen unified under the rule of Salah. who has since died. He was deposed after the Arab Spring in 2011. But even before the civil war began, though, the Houthis felt that they were a neglected minority in the northern part of the country, right? And there had been violence, even short wars in the 2000s, the decade before the civil war, right? They weren't arguing over religious doctrine, although there was a Sunni-Shia divide here, right?
Yes, correct. I mean, you could go back even further. I mean, Yemen has a very interested, quite fractious 20th century history. Portions of it were formerly a British colony around the city of Aden, the port of Aden. Following the retreat of the British in the 1960s, Yemen was split in two. Yemen was two countries for quite a long time, and there was quite a violent civil war and a series of wars that drew in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, other local states, primarily fought between, yes, the southern regions of the country, which are predominantly Sunni, and then the northern regions, which are Shia Zaidi. So these are splits that go back, as you say, centuries, but also decades into the 20th century, when Yemen was unified under a fairly authoritarian government that lasted just as long as its ruler. So these problems have been around for decades. The Houthis have emerged from a particular milieu, bringing together religious ideology, territorial disputes, and factors that are sort of endemic to Yemen's geopolitical context. It's a country that it's been difficult to sew together, and it's been difficult to prevent interventions from foreign powers.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, Saudi Arabia was involved fighting the Houthis. Before that, Saudi Arabia was involved in backing the Yemeni government. Egypt in the 1960s and 70s was very heavily involved in the war in Yemen. The UAE has been involved, and now the United States seems to be fighting against the Houthis by air from the Red Sea. So the Houthis have taken advantage of an unstable corner of the world to carve out their own particular niche, their own particular position.
Yeah, the geopolitics, so important here. Often when I'm doing shows like this one, I encourage my listeners to, while they're listening, open up a map on their laptop or their smartphone, whatever, of the Red Sea, that whole area. It's important to look at it to get a sense of what we're talking about because, I don't know, I think I have a pretty good mental image of what world geography looks like. And then I look at a map, Greg, and I say, okay, this is why I need to look at a map here. What is important about the parts of Yemen the Houthis have controlled?
Well, a couple of things. The Houthis generally control the more populous regions of Yemen. Yemen is actually a pretty populous country. It does happen to be the poorest country in the Middle East per capita, given its sort of long history of dealing with internal instability. But the Houthis have been able to cement their position over much of the more populated region of Yemen, including the capital city of Sana'a. The Houthis are also positioned very close to the Bab al-Mandeb, the strait that connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, which, as we've increasingly come to learn, is a fairly important strategic waterway through which a considerable portion of the world's commercial traffic, including oil and gas, moves every day. And the Houthis did this, they positioned themselves as they could, but they've also developed their own capabilities with the assistance of Iran quite deliberately to put them in a position where they would be able to influence the movement of commercial traffic through the Bab al-Mandeb, as they are doing currently. I mean, it's getting to the geopolitics. It's no surprise or coincidence that the Houthis happen to be sitting on a fairly significant stockpile of anti-ship ballistic missiles. That was by design. That was part of Houthi strategy. That was part of Iran's strategy, that in the event of a crisis like this, the Houthis could deploy these weapons to put pressure on the international community, to put pressure on commercial flows in service of a broader regional strategy that Iran was, if not directing, then certainly influencing. So as far as where the Houthis are, they are closely positioned to a crucial strategic waterway, the Bab al-Mandeb, and they have armed themselves with the assistance of Iran so that they have the ability to influence the movement of traffic through that strait as they are doing currently. So this was very much by design that we've seen the Houthis do what they've been doing.
So it doesn't seem like they've actually sunk many ships. Their choice of target seemed to be arbitrary. It's not like they're only attacking American or Israeli shipments going through or toward the Suez Canal. So what's the point here? Was it to provoke a massive response? Was it to essentially impose a de facto blockade, detour, if you will, because of what's going on in Gaza?
In part, yes. So, it's not controversial I don't think, to argue that the Houthis are doing what they're doing due to the situation in Gaza. That was the compelling factor that began the Houthi campaign. As you mentioned, the Houthi strikes have not sunk any ships. In fact, not a single one has been sunk as a result of these attacks. Based on my own research, I don't think any ships have suffered significant damage. No ships have suffered any casualties. So thus far, the Houthis haven't actually killed anyone, though they have suffered their own losses as a result of their activities. But more broadly, yes, they have significantly disrupted traffic through the Bab el-Mandeb. They claim to only go after ships connected to Israel or bound for Israeli ports. In the aftermath of the US-UK strikes, they now claim that they will also go after any ships connected to the United States or Great Britain due to their involvement in the strikes. However, they do seem to be somewhat indiscriminate in their targeting. There's a number of ships that have been struck or targeted that seem to bear no connection to Israel or to the conflict in Gaza. Their goal is to disrupt traffic. I don't think their goal is to close the strait. And the reason why I don't think that's their goal is a couple of reasons. They seem very conscious of avoiding targeting any vessels carrying Middle East crude or Middle East natural gas. And that's by intent, I think. The Houthis, as I mentioned, are on the verge of reaching a ceasefire agreement with Saudi Arabia. They don't necessarily want to escalate conflict with the Saudis. In fact, I think they're quite confident that the Saudis will exit the war in Yemen. They don't want to start a bigger fight with, say, the UAE or Kuwait or any other Middle East country that is still sending oil and gas through the Red Sea. And also, these countries don't seem very interested in escalating with the Houthis or putting targets on their backs by becoming involved in the U.S. efforts against the Houthis or by becoming more involved in the situation in Gaza. So the Houthis are doing what they're doing to disrupt traffic. They're also, in order to pressure Israel, the United States, the international community about the situation in Gaza, they're also doing it to show off, for lack of a better word. The Houthis are doing this to boost their prestige. As I mentioned before, they are now more interested in being viewed as a legitimate government controlling Yemen. They want to be taken seriously, and they want to display their capability and illustrate that they do have leverage over the movement of traffic through the Red Sea. They don't want to close the strait entirely, because if they did, if all traffic were diverted and the Red Sea became empty of ships,
a Houthi lake.
Then
a Houthi lake.
in that instance, the Houthis have effectively lost their leverage, right? Because if the world decides that it's simply too dangerous to sail through the Red Sea, then the Houthis could never threaten to do this again, which I'm sure they're thinking about, right?
Do we know how large their militia is?
Figures vary. The best estimates I've seen is that they have somewhere between 20 and 30,000 uniformed personnel that are armed with a variety of different weapons. The most potent weaponry they have are the weapons they're currently using. These anti-ship ballistic missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles. They have no air force to speak of. They don't have much in the way of modern military equipment that they could use in a conventional war. They do have a lot of foot soldiers, and they seem to have an ample supply of conscripts that they can send into battle to fight, say, their rival Yemeni government or, say, the Saudis of the UAE. They also seem to be quite resilient against bombings, against missile strikes, as they've shown. So that's what they have going for them.
Yeah, you just read my mind there. I was going to ask you, can the U.S. and the U.K. actually degrade their capabilities?
I would say no. Or better yet, I would say the United States is unlikely to take the action that would be necessary to degrade Houthi capabilities. The United States has a lot of firepower surrounding Yemen currently. And if the U.S. wanted to, I think it could launch a much larger campaign against the Houthis that could significantly degrade the Houthi capabilities. Now, would it prevent all Houthi attacks against shipping? I've mentioned missiles. The Houthis have actually largely been using drones as their weapon of choice. And even in the event of, prolonged U.S. bombardment, it's not too difficult to build drones in an underground factory and then launch them from a random field. I mean, the Houthis could do that even if they were under considerable aerial bombardment. So I don't think much of what the U.S. could do could significantly degrade their capabilities, or more importantly, deter them from continuing these attacks.
Well, as you know, some commentators have said the way to end these attacks on the Red Sea shipping is to get a ceasefire in Gaza.
This is part of the problem. If the Houthis can't be deterred, and if military force can't significantly degrade their capability, then how do you solve this problem? I am fairly certain that a ceasefire in Gaza would reduce Houthi attacks. I'm less confident that the Houthis would stop attacking altogether, because this has always been about more than just the situation in Gaza. The Houthis are not warriors for the liberation of Palestine. They're a particular group with a particular set of interests, most of which revolve around their own position in Yemen. The situation in Gaza has given them a very strong pretext for doing what they're doing. They're also likely getting a pretty significant push from Iran to do what they're doing because, as I mentioned, the Houthis form part of Iran's broader regional strategy. But the Houthis are interested in serving their own interests. And one significant interest that is being served by doing this is displaying capability, increasing their leverage, trying to boost their reputation, not only to get more from, say, the Saudis, but also to ensure that their position in general doesn't become dislodged. Yeah. So that has very little to do with what's going on in Gaza and much more to do with what's going on in Yemen. So even if a ceasefire in Gaza were to be called, I am not confident that the Houthis would cease their attacks altogether. They may slow, but I don't believe that they would end entirely.
And we could say that it's working. Their idea, their plan here is working. Ships are having to go around the southern point of Africa to get to the Atlantic Ocean. So Saudi Arabia, CNN.com, Peter Bergen, the national security analyst, he's been a guest on my podcast several times. He wrote a commentary saying Saudi Arabia is a key reason the Houthis are now so closely allied to Iran and so well armed. He goes on to write, in a richly ironic statement, Saudi Arabia expressed concern over the U.S.-led strikes against the Houthi targets, saying, quote, while the kingdom stresses the importance of maintaining the security and stability of the Red Sea region, in which freedom of navigation is an international demand because it harms the interests of the entire world, it calls for restraint and avoiding escalation in light of the events the region is witnessing. Again, that's from Saudi Arabia that bombed the living daylights out of Yemen and helped cause a humanitarian catastrophe. I mean, what do you make of the Saudis' role in all this? As Peter Bergen said, they're the reason the Houthis are so aligned to Iran.
It does make for an interesting historical irony, as you note. The Saudis used language that I've seen the U.S. use countless times. It was interesting to see this.
That was like the State Department drivel right there.
Yeah, very, very, very similar sort of State Department speak when you want to express concern without actually having to do anything, which I don't think the Saudis will do anything. And that kind of speaks to the broader point that I would like to make, which is that, Saudi Arabia has changed. Its leadership, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and effective ruler of the country, his attitude has changed. There was a time not that long ago where MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, was very interested in ending the civil war in Yemen and was not worried about dropping bombs to do it. He is really the reason why Saudi Arabia became so involved in Yemen. It was very much his war. And now he wants to end it. He wants to pull Saudi Arabia out of Yemen. Similarly, there was a time not that long ago where Saudi Arabia was much more concerned with confronting Iran. Now Saudi Arabia, MBS, is more concerned with reducing the temperature. And if not being friends with Iran, then at the very least, having more of a dialogue, having more of a normalized relationship, doing what Saudi Arabia can do to reduce the risk of a confrontation with Iran. That's how the position of Saudi Arabia has changed. And it's the reason why it's changed. MBS wants to focus on domestic economic development, developing the country, moving it forward, getting it away from dependence on oil exports, growing it into something different. He has all these economic mega projects, the city in Neom, all these parts of Vision 2030. That's what he wants to focus on. And he doesn't want to get dragged into another war. He doesn't want Saudi Arabia to become more exposed to external risks. Iran being one, the Houthis being the other, the situation in Gaza also being an element of that. So the Saudis, as you mentioned, they were a pivotal reason why we're in the situation that we're in vis-a-vis Yemen. That shouldn't distract from the fact that Saudi Arabia's policy towards the Houthis and towards the situation in Yemen has changed quite considerably from what it was just a few years ago.
So the anti-Iran lobby, if you will, in the United States sees this as an opportunity to punish Iran. The historian John Gazvinian has described these Iranian proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, as insurance policies. It's a way for Iran to continue to leverage its influence, whether it's waning or not, in this region, as Iran is under so much international pressure, or at least Western pressure, right? Sanctions, etc. How much does Iran actually control the Houthis, or has the monster, the Frankenstein monster? What's the metaphor I'm looking for here? When you start to control the person who created you.
Is the tail wagging the dog?
Yes, better. That's
an idiom we can use,
yes,
right?
That's geopolitical. Yeah, go ahead.
It's an interesting question. Nobody has a great deal of visibility on this because Iran, it's an opaque country. It's an opaque leadership. It can be difficult to know precisely what the Iranians are thinking, what they're doing. But their relationship with the Houthis, mirrors their relationships with other members of their regional coalition, what Iran and its members refer to as the Resistance Front. What the Resistance Front is two things. For Iran, it's a way of rallying support from like-minded groups, try to rally around of issues like the situation in Gaza, but also for Iran from more of a selfish concern. Iran is, as you mentioned, very concerned about its regional position. It faces enemies, from its perspective, it faces enemies sort of at every corner. There's Israel, which is a much more powerful military state, is also a nuclear power, a state with which Iran has a long history of antagonism. You have the Persian Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, some of the wealthiest states in the world that also enjoy support, a degree of security cooperation with the United States, which is the world's global superpower. Then you have the US itself. Iran faces the United States, it feels, on its front door. Iran, by comparison, is under heavy sanction, lacks modern military equipment outside of things like its missile capabilities. So it develops its relationships with groups like the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, a variety of militias in Iraq and Syria, as an insurance policy and also as a first line of defense or as a first means of attack in the event that it feels threatened. It develops these relationships so that it doesn't have to use its own assets. And also, if there's blowback, it doesn't face the possibility of bombs and missiles landing on its own territory. So to get to your original question, are the Houthis under Iran's control? No. Do the Houthis have full autonomy? I wouldn't say so. I would say that there is alignment and cooperation between Tehran and Sana'a. The Houthis are doing what they're doing because they want to, but it also aligns with what Iran wants. I think what we're seeing in the Red Sea is Iran's base case. The Houthis attack ships, cause disruptions, the US retaliates, bombs the Houthis. The Houthis use that to boost their prestige, make themselves look like more active members of the resistance front, and they keep attacking ships. And you just have this cycle, bombs flying in both directions. This, for Iran, is fine. So long as the US animus is directed on the Houthis and not against Iran itself. For Tehran, this is an entirely acceptable state of affairs. In fact, likely one that it has been foreseeing for some time.
And I didn't even mention Iraq. Iranian militias in Iraq as well have been targeted by the U.S. as they have been attacking U.S. troops, which raises the question, why are U.S. troops still in Iraq and why are U.S. troops still in Syria? So we'll wrap up with some larger geopolitical observations here and what concerns you most, because what happened on October 7th was a cataclysm. Not just October 7th. The Israeli response, 100 days plus of war, the dislocation of hundreds of thousands of people in a conflict that has been simmering and exploding for 75 years. The geopolitics had been moving in a direction that was much different than, say, the 1970s, when the Arab states were hostile to Israel. Now, most of them, with maybe the exception of Syria, most of them want better relations with Israel, even after what's been going on now. I mean, the Saudi-Israel normalization talks are still floating in the atmosphere. This is a very long-winded intro to a non-question, Greg, but I don't know. What are your biggest concerns here as all these conflicts persist? Gaza, the Red Sea, I mentioned Iraq and Syria. What are your top concerns, other than the one that everyone shares, the possibility of a wider, full-scale war?
I love non-questions. Those are my favorite kinds of questions. No, I'll start with that. I'll start with the possibility of a wider regional war. I mean, I'm starting to see increasingly analysts or people wonder, like, aren't we in a war already? We're seeing every group involved firing missiles, firing drones, launching attacks at each other. This looks like what a regional war might look like. And I push back against that a little bit, because what we are seeing is a lot of violence. But most of the actors involved, and here I would include Iran and the United States at the top of the list, are so concerned with trying to keep this contained that will continue to be a factor moving forward. Iran and the United States don't want a regional war. They've made that very clear with both their words and their actions, more importantly. So we're going to continue to see pressure from Tehran, from DC, to try to keep this bottled up as well as it can be. Now, given how long it's been going on for, and given the number of actors who are now involved, we are seeing a mounting risk of escalation. And I think it comes from two directions. The first is accident, miscalculation. When the fog of war falls, no one is in full control over what their allies are doing, what their proxies are doing, or even what their own soldiers are doing. I mean, we've been seeing regular attacks on US bases in Iraq and Syria by Iran's allies there. These attacks seem calibrated. They seem intended not to cause damage or casualties. But if one of these attacks were to cause damage or casualties, the US forces there, it would compel a very strong and immediate US response that could then increase the escalatory risk. Likewise, if we were to see a more aggressive, less calibrated Houthi attack on shipping, let's say they fire several missiles at an oil tanker, or if they attempt to seize more ships, or if they successfully hit a US warship, that would compel a much more muscular, aggressive US response. So without any actor involved intending to escalate or intending to increase the confrontation to one that would have regional implications. The final thing I would point at is something that you noted at the beginning of your question, which is that how this crisis began. And our focus has been on Gaza, but the crisis began in Israel with the October 7th attack. You know, the worst attack in Israel's modern history, a significant blow, morally, ideologically, politically. It's been having massive ramifications on Israel's domestic political scene. But from the point of view of geopolitics, the security implications of October 6th are still being wrestled with. Israel, as I mentioned, is one of the most powerful states in the Middle East. It's the Middle East's only proper nuclear power. And what October 7th did was it made Israel feel threatened. It upset the regional balance. And Israel is now approaching its own security situation from a very different point of view than it did on October 6th. It regards its borders as unsecure. It sees itself as being surrounded by threatening actors, Hamas being the first, Hezbollah, Iran's ally in Lebanon, being the second. So apart from the risk of unintended or miscalculation leading to escalation, I am still considerably concerned that we could see an Israeli escalation against Hezbollah or against Iran directly that then grows this into a regional conflict because Israel may feel compelled to take action to secure itself against future attack.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the unpredictable in war, because it almost always happens. In terms of Lebanon and the assassination by the Israelis of a Hamas leader, I believe it was in Beirut, right, recently, Hezbollah did not retaliate large scale. I mean, really since October 7th. As you say, it's been limited. All these encounters, with the exception of what's going on inside Gaza itself, have been limited. Hezbollah does not want a repeat of the 2006 war in Lebanon. It was a disaster for that country. And Hezbollah is more than just a militia now. It has seats in the Lebanese parliament. So, yeah, there are a lot of incentives not to escalate. But as you say, those get thrown out the window when something big and unexpected happens, as it did on October 7th.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I guess there's nothing to add to my brilliant peroration.
I wasn't sure if that was a question or not, Mark.
Yeah, I get lost in a maze of sentences, but I'll let you have the final thought here. Yeah.
No, I think you summed it up quite well. I think, looking to history can be useful, but we are in an unprecedented situation. And no one is in the driver's seat, really. The United States is trying to keep its hand on the wheel and is trying to steer this crisis in a direction that avoids a regional confrontation. It hasn't seen a great deal of success thus far, right? The war in Gaza continues. Israel continues its military operation there. A growing number of actors are becoming involved in the regional violence. As I mentioned, many are already saying we're in the middle of a regional war. Certainly, the longer that the crisis in Gaza continues, the longer we're going to see elevated risk of escalation, elevated risk of a regional confrontation. And even when peace comes to Gaza, there still will remain the massive, massive problems that face any kind of post-war settlement. Gaza has been left in ruins. 2 million people now inhabit an area of land that may be uninhabitable without significant efforts at reconstruction. Thus far, no one has come forward as being willing to take on that responsibility. Yeah. Israel doesn't seem interested in reconstructing Gaza. The Arab states of the Persian Gulf seem very wary of getting more directly involved. The United States may have to become involved, although it's unclear how an international effort to reconstruct Gaza would work. So even in the event of a ceasefire, there remain massive problems to overcome. And all of this, hovering over all of this, is the fact that Israel is unlikely to accomplish its main strategic goal, which is the destruction of Hamas.
I agree.
If we've learned anything over the last 20 years, it's that terrorist organizations are virtually impossible to eradicate completely. That will leave the crisis of October 7th unresolved.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, the elections in Taiwan. A win for democracy there and elsewhere? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.